The Pittsburgh Steelers are off to an impressive start to their season, as they have started 6-2 and Russell Wilson has brought some new life into this offense. So in today's video, I want to go over what the Pittsburgh Steelers have been doing right to start the season, as well as covering what I think their future looks like. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, but let's go ahead and hop right into it. So as I said, we are going to be talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers. Let's go ahead and briefly just cover what this team has done to start the season off, because I would say thus far, it's been pretty impressive. Up to this point, you are currently 6-2, your offense ranks fairly mediocre in a lot of different statistics, but it is pretty important that we at least emphasize that Russell Wilson has been playing the last 2 weeks and has looked significantly better, at least as a passer, than Justin Fields. I do want to give credit to Justin Fields for getting the team off to a really good start to start the season off, but I would say that Russell Wilson has just been the better pure quarterback so far. Offensively, they're averaging 23.4 points per game, which puts them at number 15 in the NFL. They're averaging 328.1 yards per game, which ranks them at number 18. And they're averaging 2.1 touchdowns per game, which puts them at number 22. Again, I want to re-emphasize that a lot of these statistics are skewed downwards because of the start to the season with Justin Fields. In recent weeks, they've been averaging easily over 25, almost 30 points a game with Russell Wilson. Defensively, this team is also ranking very well as well. They have averaged 14.9 opponents' points per game, which ranks them at number 2 in the NFL. They're giving up 310.3 yards per game, which is number 9 in the NFL, and they're only giving up 1.5 touchdowns per game, which puts them at number 2. Now, with all those statistics, I think it's very important that we go back into the past and kind of go through each individual game in some detail to at least give a little bit of context for everything that we're going to be talking about in this video. In week number 1, you went up against the Atlanta Falcons. Now listen, that Falcons team today is one of the better teams in the NFL, but at that point, Kirk Cousins was coming off his first game from that torn Achilles, so I don't think that was a terribly impressive victory because the Falcons just aren't who they are today. Then in your week 2 game, you went up against the Denver Broncos. Same sort of gist here with that one. The Denver Broncos just weren't who they are today. Back way then, Bo Nix wasn't playing very well, but obviously we know that Bo Nix is playing a lot better right now. Then after those 2 games, I would say your most impressive, at least on paper, victory thus far this year was against the LA Chargers, where you beat them 20-10. Now, similar to those first 2 teams, I still don't really know if that Chargers team, at least at that point, was playing their best football. I would say they're starting to play their best football these past couple weeks. But regardless, you still dropped 20 points on what is a very good Chargers defense, and you made Justin Herbert look uncomfortable for most of the day. But then after that, you had 2 straight losses to the Indianapolis Colts and Dallas Cowboys. I do think that if Russell Wilson was playing in those games, that they would win those games, but obviously they did not. They had Justin Fields, and I think that was maybe the stretch of games that ultimately decided who was going to be the starting quarterback after Russell Wilson got healthy. Then they beat up on the Raiders, and then Russell Wilson comes back and they drop 37 on the New York Jets and 26 on the New York Giants. Now, as you can see, through the first 8 weeks of the season, this Steelers team hasn't necessarily been tested quite yet. I know in theory, names like the Cowboys, the Jets, the Chargers, and the Falcons are all good teams, but I think once you provide the context of how they've been this year and how they were at the time of facing them, it's a little bit obvious that they haven't quite yet faced anybody. Now, fortunately for the Steelers team, they are going to be on the bye week. It's kind of a nice little bye week for them because they're sort of separating their season into 2 halves. I would say the first half of the season has been very easy for the Steelers team. 6-2 was an impressive start to their season, but they really haven't been tested by nobody. But in this second half of the season, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail here in a little bit, I would say this is more of the harder part of the season for this team because there are some really tough matchups that are really going to test out if Russell Wilson is truly the guy or not. Now, in terms of how this Steelers team is actually performing on the field, I would say they're performing at a very high level. There's a good mix of some high-level passes from Russell Wilson, and there's a good mix of some Najee Harris runs in there as well. It looks like, at least from my personal perspective, that this offense has been sort of rejuvenized with Russell Wilson. To go into detail about these last 2 weeks against the Jets and the Giants, I would say that Russell Wilson has performed very well. In that Jets game, Russell Wilson was efficient, 16 for 29 for 264 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was a slower start than you would like from a veteran like Russell Wilson, but once he got going in a bit of a rhythm and got his offense really moving down the field, he was putting some really good passes on display and getting the ball to his playmakers, and it looked very well. In this game against the Jets, the Pittsburgh Steelers had 102 yards from Najee Harris, 111 yards from George Pickens, 51 yards from Pat Freiermuth, and 44 yards from Jalen Warren. When Justin Fields was playing, you just simply weren't seeing these type of numbers from these guys. Not saying that it never happened, but you kind of get my point. With Justin Fields, he's just a little bit more raw as a passer, more than somebody like Russell Wilson, obviously. So with Russell Wilson, defenses can't just stack the box, put 7 or 8 guys in the box and just hold up against the run and force Justin Fields to throw, because Russell Wilson, if you are playing in those big stacked boxes will dice you up because he's a good passer. I think that's the main reason why they ultimately decided to bench Justin Fields for Russell Wilson, is because Justin Fields just simply can't make defenses pay for putting up with these stacked boxes. And when Justin Fields was playing, if you could slow down Najee Harris, if you could slow down Justin Fields' legs, if you could slow down Jaylen Warren, you were likely going to win the game because you were going to force Justin Fields to get into an uncomfortable state and make high-level throws. And while I feel like Justin Fields did take a big step forward this offseason in making more of those high-level difficult throws, it's just not consistent like it is for Russell Wilson right now. I do want to emphasize, I think Justin Fields will be a good quarterback for this team moving forward. Maybe not great, but could be good. I think Russell Wilson is clearly the guy, at least from what we've seen so far. Russell Wilson can just simply make defenses pay for trying to stack up the box against Najee. And the nice thing that has been showing these past couple weeks is because Russell Wilson's passing ability, they're going up against lighter boxes, and Najee Harris has been feasting because of it. Against the Jets, he had over 100 yards, and this week against the New York Giants, he also had over 100 yards as well. And I know the Giants and the Jets suck, but I do think it's pretty important to say that both those defenses have some good qualities to them. Like, the Jets have some really good players, Quincy Williams, Sauce Gardner, a bunch of other guys as well. And the same thing also does apply to this New York Giants team. Their defensive line is one of the best in the entire country. Obviously, no Kayvon Thibodeau, but still you got guys like Ojulari, and you still have Brian Burns. Not to mention that both these teams also have good linebackers as well, Bobby Okereke, and obviously I mentioned Quincy Williams for the Jets. And so yes, your offense was able to beat up on bad Giants and Jets teams, but I would also say that those were impressive offensive showcases because you went up against good defenses. Again, in that Giants game, Russell Wilson was 20 for 28, very efficient, 278 yards and 1 touchdown, doesn't get the ball in harm's way, and he made some really freaking awesome throws. There was one throw specifically that he threw to George Pickens that was just an absolute dot. And I think the big sort of stigma around Russell Wilson, at least with Denver, was that he was very conservative. He wasn't pushing the ball down the field, but that really hasn't been the case with the Steelers offense. It does look like Russell Wilson is willing to take more shots to guys like, of course, George Pickens. It also does help with the aforementioned Najee Harris. When he is dominating the run game, it's going to open up a lot more things with play action and RPOs and, of course, taking those deep shots down the field. When defenses are trying to load up against the run, it's going to open up some passing throw opportunities for Russell Wilson. And when they're not loading up against the run, then it's going to give plenty of opportunities for Najee Harris. Eventually, defenses will adjust and adapt to Russell Wilson, and I'm sure that eventually this sort of run that they're going on these past 2 weeks will die down. But if they can get like 80% of what we've seen from this offense the past 2 weeks, I think they're in pretty good shape to have a really good season. But now let's go ahead and talk about what's going to happen after the bye week, because as I mentioned earlier, this schedule gets a lot more difficult after this bye week. Because on November 10th, you have the Washington Commanders, and then after that, you have the Baltimore Ravens. I think those are clearly two of the better teams in the NFL. Yes, somehow, some way, Washington has had basically a one-year rebuild that has turned this team into an actually legitimate squad. I will say this, I think I honestly do favor the Steelers in this game. I think TJ Watt can just cause a lot of havoc on Jaden Daniels, and that secondary is playing really well as right now. And I just don't know if I buy in on that Commanders defense to slow down this run game and Russell Wilson. So I actually do think I would favor the Steelers in that matchup, but we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, that's a tough game. And then, of course, the Ravens game. Now, the Ravens did just lose to the Browns as of when I'm making the video, but I feel like it was more to do with what the Ravens didn't do with their lack of execution more than it was of what the Browns actually did. When I made my reaction video on Monday, I talked about how I felt like the Ravens' 3 losses were all their fault. They easily could have won all 3 of those games. So that does tell me that this Ravens team is really freaking awesome. In my opinion, they're like a top 5 borderline team. And I just don't know if this Steelers team can beat that Ravens team. I think they can make it competitive, but I would probably favor the Ravens by like 4.5+ points to beat the Steelers team. But again, if things go their way, maybe the Steelers could make this game interesting and maybe even win it. Then after those 2 really tough games, it gets a little bit easier, but you're going up against 3 straight AFC North opponents that have talented rosters, just haven't performed very well. And that's with the Browns on November 21st, then the Bengals on December 1st, and then the Browns again on December 8th. Again, those teams record-wise aren't very good, but we obviously know that they have the talent to make those games competitive. I know Cleveland offensively has been a mess this year, but Jameis Winston has looked like he's brought in some new life, and they still have a very good defense. And then for the Bengals, yes, their defense has been terrible this year, and they've had some issues offensively, but you still have Joe Burrow, you still have Jamar Chase, Trey Hendrickson is still a great player, so that's definitely going to be a tough matchup. And then to end the season off, I mean, this is ridiculously difficult. You have the Eagles, then the Ravens, then the Chiefs, and then you end the season off with the Bengals. I'll be honest with you, I think I would have a hard time favoring this Steelers team in any of those games. Not saying they can't win those games, But I look at that Eagles team and I'm like, I think the Steelers are going to lose that game. Same thing with the Ravens again, same thing with the Chiefs. And in the Bengals game, maybe I would favor the Steelers. This is really the big test of the season. Obviously, these next upcoming 2 weeks against the Commanders and Ravens are also a ginormous test. But if you want to talk about, is this team a Super Bowl contender or not, I think that stretch against the Eagles, Chiefs, and Ravens is really going to tell us if this team is an actual Super Bowl contender. So I think that does raise the question of what is the ceiling for this Steelers team? If you're asking me, I think the ceiling for the Steelers team is like 12-5 or 13-4. And when it comes to their ceiling in terms of playoff success, I think it's pretty obvious that they will likely potentially make the playoffs, maybe win the division even. And I think if they do win the division or make the playoffs, I think this is a team that could probably make a somewhat good run in the postseason. Obviously, the stigma around the Steelers team is that they're very successful in the regular season, and once they get into the playoffs, they just continue to just struggle because they're going up against good quality teams. But with what I've seen from this offense with Najee Harris, George Pickens, and Russell Wilson, it definitely makes me feel a little bit more optimistic about what this team can actually do in the postseason if they were to make it this year. Obviously, it would take a lot of things to go their way in the second half of the season, but if those things do fall their way, I think this team could be a really good team that could maybe make a deep playoff run. Now, would I say they're Super Bowl contenders? I don't think so, because I would favor teams like the Chiefs, the Bills, and the Ravens over the Steelers, but I do think that they could give each of those teams a good run for their money, like past teams with Kenny Pickett just simply couldn't. Again, the second half of the season is going to tell us a whole lot more about this Steelers team, more so than the first half of the season, because they just haven't really faced anybody yet, even if they have looked dominant against those bad teams. It's just hard to say how good this team is until they actually face somebody who's maybe even a playoff team. We will know after the end of this Washington and Ravens run here, because those are two playoff contenders, and honestly, those are probably two Super Bowl contenders. At least the Ravens, I think, are legitimate championship contenders. And then we'll know even more by the time we get to the very end of the season. I think right now, maybe it's a tad bit early to say that they're contenders, but I do think that they'll be making the playoffs. And I think this team, if things go their way, can make a deep playoff run, again, if things go their way. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, what do you guys think about this Pittsburgh Steelers team? Do you guys think that they're just simply playoff contenders like I do? Or do you guys think that this team is already Super Bowl contenders? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.